Get started. My name is Michael Green. I'm the chairman of the DPW Committee in the Common Council. For those of you who don't know, we're in the middle of our budget hearings right now, so it's the worst possible time to have a meeting and get councilors to come. But this is something that's very important to me. I think it's important to the community to have safer streets in the city. So I just wanted to get on the schedule, get the process moving. So I'd like to introduce Neil Burke. And just I'll turn it over to you, and you can kind of make the presentation of the items. Sorry, and then process-wise too. So what we're going to do is Neil's going to make his presentation, the council, and if anyone else comes, then ask questions, and then we'll allow a brief comment period for anyone that wants to make a comment. Not super interactive. I'm not trying to put Neil in the hot seat here, but just kind of a general feedback to it from the community is what we're looking for. So.
Thank you, Councilor Green. So I'm Neil Burke. I'm the city's transportation planner. I work for the Department of Public Works and in close proximity to the city's planning department. We're here today to discuss an initiative that we're calling Safe Streets Syracuse. On the initial invitation, you may have seen it was referred to as Vision Zero. This is pretty much the same thing. We're rebranding that as our own and pulling specific pieces out of Vision Zero and other programs across the country and crafting our own safety initiative. So the Safe Streets Syracuse initiative represents a combination of multiple strategies aimed at reducing fatalities and serious injuries on city streets. The initiative will focus on increasing safety for all users, safety and comfort for all users of the transportation network by incorporating those best practices, pulling from Vision Zero, and really harping back on what has been demonstrated to work in other communities already. Many communities have already begun this process of treating serious injuries and deaths from automobile-related crashes as preventable outcomes on the transportation network. That doesn't mean that the freak accident, the 1 in a million crash, is avoidable. What that means is the vast majority of instances where we have serious bodily injury on our transportation network is preventable in some shape or fashion. This initiative will focus on system-wide initiatives that will have a broad impact, which is a best practice set forth by Vision Zero. So some key findings here. New York State noted that Syracuse had a high rate of pedestrian crashes during the state's Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. This was a process put forth by the governor in response to an increase in pedestrian and motor vehicle conflicts. This was a round of funding that was opened up to the entire state. Syracuse was designated as a focus community. We received some funding to go after things like uncontrolled stops and adjust our signalized intersections for better performance and better safety outcomes. Speed is a key determinant of mortality rates of vehicular crashes involving pedestrians. And you can see on the very frightening graphic on the screen that this is a serious concern. A pedestrian struck by a car at 40 miles an hour has a 10% chance of survival, while a pedestrian struck by a car at 20 miles an hour has a 90% chance of survival. We're not saying we want pedestrians to be struck by cars. What we're saying is we want to reduce motor vehicle speeds where appropriate on our network. Additionally, deaths and serious injuries from transportation-related crashes disproportionately affect the young and the very old. And just one little bit more, the stopping distance of a vehicle traveling 25 miles an hour versus 30 miles an hour, there's a 45-foot difference in the time it takes a car to stop. So a car traveling at 25 miles an hour stops 45 feet shorter than a car traveling just at 30 miles an hour. That is a significant increase, and that is representative of some of the approaches we want to take here. Systematic approaches to reducing vehicle speeds and increasing safety for all users. Some of the key features of this initiative revolve around leadership and commitment. So, the administration, Common Council, and applicable city officials would commit to this goal of seriously reducing or eliminating serious injuries or fatalities on city streets. Prioritization of city projects that have safety benefits, especially for the most vulnerable users, is another part of this, as well as sustained and significant funding that is for the explicit benefit of the Safe Streets Syracuse related projects. So some of the very specific short-term initiatives that would be proposed here is, first and foremost, to co-sign with the City of Ithaca on their petition to New York State to reduce speed limits within the city of Syracuse. Currently, that is under New York State control. They set the minimum, which is 30 miles an hour, unless you're in a very specific zone, like a school zone. What this petition would do would be to tell the state we would like a little bit more control over the speed limits in our community. Doesn't mean that we would have a blanket approach of reducing every speed limit across the city. But I'm sure, as many of you know, in residential areas on very quiet streets, 30 miles an hour is well above where you need to be traveling in order to get where you're going safely. Item number 2 would be to expand the sidewalk clearing pilot. It operated this past winter with a good degree of success, and we're looking to expand it this winter as a pilot still. But what this proposal would do would be to make that permanent, to keep that priority network of streets and their sidewalks open all winter long. The third would be signal timing adjustments. This is a system-wide approach in incorporating a leading pedestrian interval at all signalized intersections in the city of Syracuse. The LPI, the leading pedestrian interval, is a no-cost, surefire way to save lives. It has been proven, it has been documented and instituted in many cities in the U.S. And what an LPI is just a little bit of a head start. So when you're waiting across the street, you notice traffic is stopped as well. They have the red light. What happens now is that the red light turns to green. At the same time, the pedestrian gets the walk signal. An LPI gives the pedestrian 1 or 2 seconds before that light turns green to start crossing. It is a simple and practical approach that leads to increased that leads to increased compliance by motor vehicles yielding the right-of-way to pedestrians crossing the street. Number 4 would be work zone traffic control updates. And this is something that if you walk around downtown, other parts of the city, the east side, places where you have significant amounts of development, you'll notice that often the sidewalk is blocked. There might be a trailer on it. There might be trucks parked on it. There might be construction fencing up. We permit that to happen as part of our road closures currently. This proposal would update that to require that all road or sidewalk closures have an adequate work zone traffic control plan in place, which we do require now, but we would require another step, and that is to ensure that pedestrians have a clear path at all times that is ADA compliant. This is not something we're dreaming up or we're making up on the spot. This is a best practice from other municipalities and something that does not add undue burden or cost to the person pulling that permit. The fifth would be community streets, and this is formal support for innovative and artistic approaches to community-led projects on city-owned streets. This would be things like painted crosswalks, intersection art, other pop-up displays. Currently, we have a bit of a roadblock in implementing those projects. We do have communities coming to us asking if they can have the middle school paint the crosswalk with, their the paw prints or something like that. It's a great approach. It's used elsewhere. It's something we should support formally and give people a surefire way, an understandable process in order to move these projects forward. 6 would be dedication to complete streets. And this would be all projects related to public streets would incorporate complete streets guidelines that prioritize safety and accessibility for all users. We already have adopted complete streets as part of the 2040 plan. What this would do, it would be a rededication to those principles and make those principles explicit in our road projects moving forward. On top of that, this would include a formal endorsement of the NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, Urban Street Design Guide, as the base level design guide for all roadway projects moving forward. This guide has been endorsed by by the Federal Highway Association as well as other required bodies, and it opens up our toolkit. It expands upon the options that we have as a city for what our roads and streets can look like. Number 7 would be right-of-way guidelines, the development and adoption of right-of-way and/or street design guides clearly outlining required features of the right-of-way for adjacent frontage areas. And what this means is, as a property owner, as a business owner, we would give you a clear and concise guide to what your sidewalk should look like, what your street tree would look like, where things are supposed to be, and this would be a compilation of existing items and existing requirements that we already have, as well as illustrations and further consideration for streetscape enhancements and quality urban design. These are the current initiatives included in the draft. This is intended to be a living document for the time being, so these initiatives may change, more may be added, or they might be reduced. So, moving this forward, we'd like to make a commitment to equitable investment in projects across the city. All findings, projects, initiatives, and other materials would be shared with both decision makers and the public. Short-term initiatives do require further research and development before being adopted or presented as either individual or a package of resolutions. Applicable city staff, including council, will be invited to form working groups, and all guides, documents, reference materials would be made publicly accessible through the city's website. This would apply to any updates to the Safe Streets Syracuse proposal, as well as other materials. And with that, I end the short and sweet proposal, or presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Councilor
I
Green.
think the council has a couple questions. Okay, so first, the speed limit petition. So there are some cities now that have this already. I know when I was in New York City, they had lowered their speed limit. So what's kind of the status of that?
New York City is a unique case in this regards, as it is for many other state-specific requirements. They tend to get their own carve-outs. They have a slow zone program, which has expanded to, I can't remember the number of centerline miles, but a significant portion of New York City streets. And what this does is it sets up perimeter streets, primary arterials, main streets. Those remain 30 miles an hour. Nothing changes there. But on the interior, in the residential blocks, that is where you see a reduction to 20 and 25 miles an hour, with the inclusion of other interventions like speed bumps and things like that.
signal timing adjustments. So just in terms of the actual process of that, like how do they physically change? Like I don't even understand the process of how they work now.
So we have a few hundred of our signals currently connected together, and we can control them from the traffic control center housed at DPW. Adjustments can be made there. However, we also have a dedicated signal operator who inspects and adjusts signals as their day-to-day job. This isn't something we could just flip a switch and institute, but it is something we have the capacity to undertake in a rapid fashion.
Okay. The NACDO Urban Street Design Guide. So understanding that there's a lot of components to that, but what are the kind of main things that differ from our status quo right now here in Syracuse?
So the design guide, it's summed up very well in this quote, and the guide was endorsed by the FHWA in 2014, and beyond its clear vision for complete streets, it also integrates stormwater management and engaging public spaces to create environmentally and socially focused streetscapes. And that's a long-winded, fancy way of saying it is a design guide. It's a toolkit for communities of all sizes to properly utilize their right-of-way in their streets to ensure that you have safe, accessible transportation for all.
So what would be an example of something that would be the biggest departure from what we currently do?
I'm not interested in throwing anyone under the bus, especially in my own department, but our practices, many of which have not been updated in quite some time, are focused almost exclusively on the throughput of motor vehicles. So our signal timing, our slurry seal programs, our recon items. A lot of these are very difficult projects, and they serve a significant need. However, there are steps we could take to potentially lay a little bit less asphalt, be a little bit more judicious about our curb cuts, and also be conscious of restoring tree lawns and snow storage space to streets that may have lost it over time.
Okay. So then the right-of-way guidelines, I mean, so in practice, is this something that on future developments where the right-of-way is being changed, that's when we would look to implement that, or how would this roll out?
Yeah, the right-of-way guidelines is something that has been in various stages of development for quite some time, and this relates to requests for encroachments. A lot of sites may have features that encroach, like maybe it's a stair set or maybe it's a parking pad, and without clear guidelines of what we need in the right-of-way, it's tough to properly evaluate encroachments in a reliable and predictable manner. So the right-of-way guidelines is really just a snapshot of what the front of your property to the curb line should look like. Some of those features fall to the responsibility of the property owner currently, like sidewalk maintenance. Some of that falls to the city of Syracuse, like street trees and pruning. And some of it can be either or, depending on who did what over the years.
So last question. On a spectrum of how well designed streets are and how well focused towards pedestrian bicycle activity, on that range, I mean, how would you evaluate where Syracuse is now, and who are some of the cities that have done a really good job of it, and what are the outcomes been in those places?
So we have plenty of great examples of streetscapes that meet the needs of all. You know, the connective corridor is a continuous streetscape that, while may have been rolled out in an interesting fashion, did provide us with wide ADA compliant sidewalks, high visibility crossings, retimed street lights, bike lanes, parking, right-sized travel lanes. That's a very good example, and probably the largest example that we have in one piece. However, if you look out here behind City Hall, Water Street, the redesign of Water Street that happened a few years ago is an excellent example of these initiatives in practice. You have the right-sized travel lanes, you have slow speeds, you have mid-block crossings acknowledging that people are traveling to the Erie Canal Museum and they need a way to get there, but you also aren't shortchanging motor vehicles in any way. You still have plenty of on-street parking. You have shorter distances to cross at the intersections. So it's projects like those that I think are good examples of these initiatives.
Sorry, and then I lied. I have one more. So when you're thinking about these things, obviously there's avoiding accidents, avoiding fatalities, but then can you talk a little bit about secondary benefits, whether it be health benefits, whether it be real estate prices, whether it be equity in terms of the type of users that might, who are the type of people that are more likely to be walking. So just kind of the general impact on the city and the neighborhoods and that.
That's a good question. I think it's worth pointing out that the city of Syracuse has a poverty rate that is quite high, and now disposable income has a direct impact on your transportation options and the numbers available to you. So while we may think of, it might be easy to think of someone who identifies as a cyclist as someone with plenty of disposable income to purchase a nice bike and plenty of spandex and a fancy helmet. There are a lot of people who may be traveling to work are taking the simplest, quickest, easiest form of transportation that they have available to them right then and there that day. That might be on foot, that might be by bike, that might be the bus, you name it. It could also be in a motor vehicle. We don't want to shortchange one mode for another. However, there are serious tangible benefits to providing a breadth of options when it comes to transportation for all. As it relates to property values and environmental issues, quality streetscapes have a noticeable effect on property values, but also on the feeling and the perception of safety. So perception very much is reality to the users. And if you feel safe and comfortable in your environment, you may choose to walk more. You may choose to leave the car in the driveway. Whereas if you live on a street that does not feel safe when you walk down it, perhaps traffic is fast, maybe there's no sidewalk or it's intermittent, that may be a deterrent for you as someone who might be a choice user. That might be a deterrent for you to walk or bike or take transit.
Which is also an environmental
Yep.
issue as well. All right. Anyone would like to make a public comment? Barry, you look like you're itching. Okay.
Yeah, I live at,
Wanna just
name
introduce
is Barry
yourself?
Lentz.
Barry, okay, great.
I live at 1011 Westcott Street, which is approximately halfway between Euclid and Broad Street, which are the two significant broad cross streets. Both of them are signaled. There's no other intersection that's signaled on Westcott Street in my area because all the other streets, except for one, are just perpendicular streets coming into Westcott, not full cross streets. Traffic on my street routinely goes over 50 miles an hour at periods of throughout the day. In fact, we had one accident last week in which a car was clocked at 100 miles an hour in my section of Westcott Street. I'm skeptical about the notion of change in speed limits impacting that because that requires a kind of enforcement that I don't think is realistic in the city of Syracuse. I'm wondering what kinds of solutions are included in the Safe Streets approach to address situations like that, other than putting stop signs in places where people don't seem likely to do. I mean, we've had several accidents where cars have actually gone airborne and caused significant property damage and other kinds of vehicle damage in that whole section. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one step that we would take would be to lower speed limits. However, that comes with a number of other pieces that need to be put in place. We have to be very judicious about how we use signage because the more we use it where it's not warranted, we may see lower rates of compliance. So like you said, a stop sign that perhaps is ill-placed might not see compliance. It might see drivers rolling through it. The goal of reducing speed limits across the city of Syracuse would not be simply to change the signs. It would be to change the way that we design our streets and making sure that they are designed to an appropriate speed. So if the speed limit was reduced from 30 to 20 on a side street, when we came through to reconstruct that street years later, we would ensure that we're designing to the 20 mile an hour standard, not the 30 mile an hour standard. There are features like bump outs, lane widths, where the on-street parking is, as well as other pieces of the right of way that can encourage or discourage speeding. All of that would be taken into account because, as you said, we can't just change the signs and expect compliance. Another portion of this is enforcement, and that is a conversation that moving forward we will have directly with SPD because they're a vital part of all of this. But in terms of just reducing the speed limit and calling it quits, that's definitely not the approach.
How are you going to handle when the street does not belong just to the city, but it's maybe like a state street or a responsibility of DOT? Like, for instance, one of the examples of dangerous roads is the Erie Boulevard, and our agency has brought that issue numerous times to the city DPW just to make sure that the crossings are properly marked, just to increase safety of pedestrians because you have high traffic with cars and it's almost impossible to cross those pedestrian crossings. And we haven't seen any improvements for years, so I was wondering how are you going to handle when it doesn't just belong to the city, and also, how are you going to gather public input on some of those dangerous intersections that people know about that you might not be aware of?
So the city of Syracuse, first and foremost, cannot force the state to act. However, we do value our working relationship with the state. And as it relates to Erie Boulevard specifically, we have been a partner in the redesign that is forthcoming of Erie Boulevard, making sure that the state understands we have issues when it comes to crossings on Erie Boulevard. We have very, very long blocks which promote mid-block crossings. And as we've seen, there have been deaths attributed to that. Part of the redesign process will incorporate better crossings, and the state is getting much better at this. However, we are, again, we value our partnership with them because it's a working relationship, and we hold them accountable as well. As far as input and community engagement, that is a critical factor in all of this. So instead of just another top-down approach, it is important to understand and give communities a bit more say in what's happening. And that gets back to the Community Streets Initiative, which prioritizes community-led projects stemming from issues like specific areas where there's speeding or specific areas where the crossing is unsafe or unmarked. That is exactly what the community streets portion of this is meant to do. However, community engagement that is robust and meaningful, as well as documenting that engagement, is part of this.
Other questions? I have one, so. Sorry, go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, a follow-up question. Since
Barry, you want to just come up to answer?
Follow-up question, since we brought up the Erie Boulevard situation. I was at a presentation that Sam Gordon just did for the DeWitt Sustainable Plan, and he got a rousing cheer from the audience when he presented their plan for Erie Boulevard. So I'm just curious, what's our plan for continuing that redesign of Erie Boulevard all the way through Erie Boulevard in Syracuse to, I presume it would be Teal Street at least, where it would go to. Anything about that?
Sure. So the plans Sam presented are the state's plans that we all developed in tandem. There won't be a stark contrast between what you see in DeWitt and what you see on the city portion of Erie Boulevard, and it will start around Beach Street. However, the most intensive treatments will be found Teal East. And we've been a partner with the town of DeWitt. Obviously, our that roadway links us together in more ways than one, and in not some not so great ways as well. But collaboration is the key, and I think you're seeing that with both the state's approach to Erie Boulevard as well as the mayor's approach to the 81 issue as well.
Which brings me to my question. So in the report, one of the things that's recommended is eliminating certain one-way streets. So I'm wondering if that's something, so just as context, I used to live on Clinton Street, and I would say twice an hour someone would go the wrong way down the one-way street, and it was just like hold your breath and hope they figure it out. So I guess, is that something we would want to look at, is additional reduction of one-way streets within the city?
I knew that there was no way we were getting out of here without talking about 81. However, what I can say is, in regards to Clinton Street, we are evaluating how to make improvements there, as well as our friends at the SMTC did put out a two-way analysis a few years ago, which is a valuable document, which highlights a lot of these approaches as well. But the specifics I don't think we can get into right now. However, information is forthcoming.
Okay. Thanks. Any further? Yeah, come on up. Want to just introduce yourself?
Perrine Wasser. I live in the university neighborhood, and I know two people who have been hit on their bikes in the university neighborhood. We have bike lanes on Euclid now, which is a big step, but people are parking in the bike lanes, and especially in the university neighborhood, we're having a lot of issues that I've seen with ride-sharing cars and food delivery cars that park in the bike lanes and causing bikes to swerve out into traffic and such. And I'm wondering if that's being considered.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do finally have bike lanes on Euclid, which is great. However, what's not great is if we do have delivery drivers or TNC operators who are pulling into the bike lanes. Part of the guides that we would like to adopt address this through structural changes, physically protecting our infrastructure for cyclists, not across the board, but where appropriate. If there are items related to compliance, again, that's a conversation we'll be having moving forward with SPD. However, if we're going to make the investment in this infrastructure, we want it to be safe and accommodating, but also realistically useful. I think we've made some strides on Euclid and compared to the odd-even bike lane situation that was happening in years past. But I do think there's room for improvement, as there are across the board on streetscapes, not just in Syracuse, but in municipalities around the country. And what these initiatives would do would be to put us in a position to innovate as well as learn from our peers what those best practices are.
And I think, to your point too, we have a culture in this city of treating pedestrians and bicyclists as second-class citizens, and that's just the candid reality of it. So it's not something that's going to change overnight, but what I think we need is a commitment to leadership from city government and others that you're an equal user of the road, whether you're a pedestrian, whether you're a bicyclist, and that's going to take a big commitment, but it's something that I'm certainly committed to, and I know Neil is as well, and others. So, yeah. Any other questions? Comments? Yeah, come on.
So in all of the proposed structural changes, I think they're wonderful to help people who don't currently feel safe in the city. But I want to, ask, are there people of color and women in the planning process and in the design process and ultimately in the decision making, and not just, in the community engagement process? Because what may feel safe for an able-bodied white man might not feel safe for everyone.
So this is the beginning right now. The process hasn't incorporated a larger audience to date. However, that's part of this. We definitely want this to be an inclusive process. And I mentioned earlier, not just having the top-down approach, which we've had for quite some time, and that is the way that municipalities operate. But this is meant to be an inclusive process. again, that lends support and legitimacy to members of the community who feel that there is an issue, and it gives them an outlet for addressing that issue that is tangible and realistic.
And I guess just to follow up on that too, this is step one in this, but to the extent that you are aware of community members that want to be part of it or that are willing to share their perspective, definitely have them email myself and we'll include them because that's absolutely what we're looking for. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you for starting this process.